The First World War, the 30 Years' War, the Second World War, and the current, the Russia-Ukraine War. Some of the deadliest and longest wars in history have had one continent in common: Europe. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a deeper look at Europe, its setup, the relationship across the countries, and the reason the continent has mostly been at war through the course of history. Is Europe really a continent, or is it just Western Asia separated from mainland Asia by the Ural Mountains? You could argue either way, but the interesting thing is that it is these natural barriers, like the Ural Mountains, that really are the essence of the geography and history of Europe. Europe has 44 countries across a land area of 9.9 million square kilometers. In contrast, Asia has 48 countries across a land area of 44.60 million square kilometers. That means Europe has almost 4 times more countries per million square kilometers than Asia. And that is the primary reason for conflict within Europe. Too many countries competing with each other. But why did Europe end up with so many countries? The primary reason is geography. Geography meaning natural barriers like rivers, mountains, and other water bodies like the English Channel, which separates Great Britain and Ireland from the rest of Europe, or Italy, which is protected by the Alps, or Hungary, which is protected by the Carpathian Mountains. So with these natural barriers, it was not easy historically for an alien invader to dislodge their opponent who was sitting behind the geographical boundary. And not surprisingly, one of the most indefensible borders has been the France-Germany border, which has had no natural boundary. So all ambitious European leaders, from Charlemagne, Napoleon to Hitler, often started with making this border meaningless before invading any other territory. So historically, competition and war have dominated the relationships between various European countries. And because of the proximity to each other, many times small wars have escalated into bigger conflict, with various countries taking sides between the two warring factions. And one of the best examples of this is the First World War. Before the World War I, political instability existed particularly in the Balkans, in Bosnia, Serbia, and Herzegovina, and it threatened to destroy the peace across Europe. And on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was shot dead along with his wife by a Serbian nationalist. The Serbian nationalists were trying to end the Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, under normal circumstances, one would have expected a conflict to erupt between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Balkans. But then Russia supported Serbia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had support from Germany. So on July 28, Austria and Hungary declared war on Serbia. But within a week, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Serbia had lined up against Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and suddenly a small conflict became World War I. Another reason for Europe having so many wars is the religious divisions within the continent. Wait, isn't Europe mostly Christian? That is true. But there are a wide range of different sects of Christianity in Europe. And the rifts between these various sects of Christianity have been a major source of wars within the continent. Eastern Europe is dominated by Orthodox Christianity, but the many branches of Orthodoxy have led to conflicts across Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, Catholicism was the denomination of Christianity until the Protestant movement began in 1517. And that led to Western Europe being split between Catholic and Protestant nations, and that itself has led to several hundred years of wars. And these include the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, to the Troubles in Ireland from 1960 to 1998. When it comes to religious wars, the 30 Years' War is considered to be one of the longest and most brutal wars in human history. It lasted 30 years, and during that time, more than 8 million lives were lost from the military battle, famine, and disease caused by the conflict. It started as a war between the Catholic and the Protestant states across Europe, but gradually evolved into who would finally govern Europe. When Ferdinand II ascended the Holy Roman Empire throne in 1619, one of his first actions was to force the citizens of the empire to adhere to Roman Catholicism, even though the Treaty of Augsburg, signed in September 1555, allowed rulers to choose either Lutheranism or Roman Catholicism. And this decree from Ferdinand was enough to re-trigger tensions between the two religious sects. And the displeasure was made evident at the defenestration of Prague. Defenestration. What is that? Well, the Bohemian nobility showed their displeasure against Ferdinand II's decree by throwing his representatives out of a window at Prague Castle in 1618. Yes, throwing somebody out of a window is called defenestration, and that is exactly what happened in Prague. And very aptly, the first stage of the 30-Year War came to be known as the Bohemian Revolt, with the Bohemian nobility forming alliances with the Protestant Union states, that is modern-day Germany, while Ferdinand II sought the support of his Catholic nephew, Philip IV of Spain. In 1630, Sweden joined on the Protestant side, and then in 1637, Ferdinand II passed away. But meanwhile, in 1635, the French too entered the conflict against Ferdinand II. Finally, in 1648, the various parties in the conflict signed a series of treaties called the Peace of Westphalia, and that effectively ended the 30-Year War. However, there was significant change that Europe underwent at the end of the war. The biggest one being that the Peace of Westphalia laid the groundwork for the formation of the modern nation state, establishing clearly that the residents of a state were subject to the laws of that state and not of any other institution, secular or religious. In other words, the power and influence of the Catholic Church was significantly reduced across Europe. Now, as Europe moved from the medieval times into the modern era, there were a lot of political movements and ideologies that started coming up, especially because of the fact that there were several monarchies across Europe. Ideologies such as Nazism, communism, fascism, all of these originated in Europe. And all of these resulted in wars. From the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, to the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1923, the early part of the 20th century was when Europe came face to face with these ideologies and decided on the future course through wars. The interesting thing here is that Nazism, fascism came to the fore after World War I. It was a time when Europe was looking for new leaders to bring about national unity, and Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler came to the fore with their ideologies. And these ideologies would finally lay the groundwork for the Second World War. One World War laid the foundation for the Second World War. As I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, one of the interesting features of Europe is the number of countries within such a small area. And with this number of countries came several kings, dynasties, and dynastic rivalries, which is another reason why the continent has had so many wars. Europe has had a network of dynasties, and many times they married into each other to gain or retain control across the nations. And many times they've also fought wars over royal successions. When a monarchy grew weak, other nations launched invasions to take control of it. Sometimes the line of succession itself was disputed and conflicts arose to install a more favorable monarch in place. The Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871 and the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1715 are some examples of the dynastic influence of wars. However, the War of Roses from 1455 to 1487 trumps them all when it comes to dynastic rivalries. And the reason for that is that both sides in the war were descendants from the same family. The Wars of the Roses were a series of bloody civil wars for the throne of England between two competing royal families, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and both were members of the royal Plantagenet family. These wars were waged between 1455 and 1485, and they got the name because the white rose was the badge of the Yorks and the red rose was the badge of the Lancastrians. And during the 30 years of the war, both sides gained and lost power multiple times. Richard, the Duke of York, nearly unseated the Lancaster king Henry VI in 1460, but was killed in battle a few months later. York's son, Edward IV, crushed the Lancasters in battle and claimed the throne before he was deposed in 1470. But he won back his kingship and ruled for several years until his sudden death in 1483, which launched yet another period of infighting, which saw the Yorkist Richard III and Lancastrian Henry Tudor elbow their way into power. Across a span of 25 years, 5 different rulers came to the throne, 3 of whom were killed or executed by their rivals. And since the war lasted 30 years, many key figures even switched allegiances through the course of the war. So be it religion, number of countries, number of monarchies, Europe seems to have been at war for a decent amount of time through history. After so many wars and so many deadly battles, how did Europe end up colonizing the rest of the world and advancing in technology? The simple answer: fierce internal competition. For years and decades, various European countries had been competing with each other in the battlefield. And then in 1760, the Industrial Revolution happened. And all of a sudden, glory to the king, which was the primary motivation for battles within Europe, took a back seat, and it got replaced by commercial advantage. So wars no longer needed to be fought for personal glory of the king, but some commercial advantage had to come along with the war. And as the Industrial Revolution spread, there was a fierce competition to gain the upper hand with respect to technology, specifically warfare technology. Now, with the advancement of gunpowder technology, the effective firing rates also improved, which meant that the European armies could expand beyond Europe and look at conquering external lands. But the primary motivation still was commercial, because along with the Industrial Revolution came the need for finding new markets for the industrial output, and along with that, the need to find raw materials for the industries that were being set up. And with the advancement in warfare technology and strong navies, European countries started exploring the world via the sea route for new markets as well as sources for raw materials. Getting ahead in the commercial game was the new motivation. While colonization and global expansion increased Europe's influence across the world, we also need to be aware of the 160 different ethnic groups that exist in Europe. And that is another reason for the various conflicts that keep occurring in Europe. Between 160 ethnic groups, about 200 different languages are spoken across the continent. Within the small geographical area and a dense population, ethnic identities many times override country identities. And this creates virtual divisions within a country itself, and oftentimes it has led to the breakup of countries after a prolonged conflict. Some of the wars fought on ethnic lines include the Crimean War in 1853, the Kosovo War in 1998, and the Bosnian Civil War in 1992. One point to note here, though, is that post-World War II, when most of the economies of Western Europe were in a poor state, the frequency of wars across Western Europe reduced drastically. There was a new bully in town: Russia and the Soviet Union. Though there were fewer wars, but there was a lot of conflict within the Soviet satellite states. Technically, a country which has majority of its land in Asia was calling the shots in Europe. A lot of the satellite states from Eastern Europe were not too happy with their new master, the Soviet Union. So starting in 1953, with the uprising in East Germany, there was the 1956 Hungarian Revolution that I talked about in episode 7, and the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia were a clear message from the Eastern Bloc countries in Europe to the Soviet Union that the Soviets were not welcome here. But most of these ended up being crushed by the Soviets. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union, several of the satellite states went through a lot of internal strife in trying to re-identify themselves, and this led to a lot of ethnic conflicts, which finally led to the breakup of several states in Eastern Europe along ethnic lines. The most prominent being Yugoslavia, which broke up into Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, and North Macedonia between 1991 and 2001. So is Europe ever going to come out of this cycle of endless wars? Well, the only hope was the European Union, since it aimed to unify Europe on the economic front. But after Brexit and the anti-EU narrative that came out of it, I'm not too sure about that either. The Russia-Ukraine conflict adds another color to the conflicts in Europe, but this one seems more temporary, very much a function of the brutal dictator who governs Russia today. And just like all dictatorships, this one too will end one day, and Europe may be back to its endless cycle of wars amongst each other. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. When did AT&T stop offering telegraph services? Though the telephone came in as the competitor to telegraph services, telegrams continued to be popular for a long time because they offered a written record of the communication. And it was only after email became popular that the telegraph started losing its market. So it was only in 1991 that AT&T decided to end its telegraph services. So the answer is B, 1991. Question for the current episode. Which European country has had the longest period of peace? Is it A, Sweden, B, Liechtenstein, C, Ireland, or D, Switzerland? Once again, which European country has had the longest period of peace? A, Sweden, B, Liechtenstein, C, Ireland, or D, Switzerland? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we look across the emerging diplomatic, economic, and political equation between the emerging economies and the superpowers, and how the world may slowly be turning multipolar. In other words, we'll take a look at the new emerging world order. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.